I'd now like to introduce Dr Aubrey Burl, who, as I said earlier, probably doesn't need this introduction. Aubrey, for many years, was the principal lecturer in prehistory at Hull Higher College of Education and is a renowned expert and authority on the megalithic in Britain. His books are The Great Stone Circles of Britain, which is available here. This normally costs £40, by the way, but we're able to offer it today for £28. So I'd very much encourage that purchase. And in fact, Aubrey says that he would be willing to sign some of those books. He's also at a price. We had a quote that said that he'd been going around in circles for many, many years. But he now tells me he's going straight. What that means, I don't know. But let's give a very big welcome to Aubrey Burl.
Well, I'm sorry the weather's so awful. At least it's dry in here. I was reminded, I just heard this lovely expression that photographs don't lie. And there was somebody criticising the painter, Pablo Picasso. He said, "Your paintings are all lies, but photographs don't lie. This is what my son looks like," showing him a photograph. And Picasso said, "Is your son really that small?" Now, right, well, that's it. What I want to do this afternoon, because you've not been told the title of this talk, have you? Sorry? You have been told the title. Right, well, you're going to operate from back there, are you? Okay, let's shoot. I think we'll need about 16 curtains drawn and some lights out. Right, good. No, I can see it. Now, I'm not going to give you a lecture about Stonehenge, but I'm going to use Stonehenge as a sort of vehicle to show the different attitudes towards stone circles, whether it's Stonehenge or the Rollright Stones or Callanish or some virtually unknown site. They all have this rather strange history. In other words, they are reflections of the time when people looked at them. I rather like that top line. I think about 14, perhaps 24 people need to leave. Right, can I have the next, please? Now, it is sometimes said that Romans destroyed Stonehenge because it was a druidical centre of resistance. And here you see it, parts of it. By the time the Romans saw it, Stonehenge had been abandoned for at least 1,000 years. So we've lost 1,000 years, which isn't very much really if you think of it. We've lost 1,000 years of people's reactions to it. We know that Iron Age people went there because we found Iron Age pottery there and so on, but what they thought about it, we just don't know. It has been said, as I say, that the site was ruined by the Romans because they wished to get rid of a centre of opposition. I think it's much more likely that what we're looking at here is the effect of the weather. This is the southwest side of Stonehenge, and this is the side that has suffered the most collapse. So I think all we can say about the Romans is that they were tourists. They went to Stonehenge, they had little picnics there, they dropped things like brooches, even coins. There is no evidence at all that they actually destroyed the site. So we can forget about the Romans, really. Could we go on to the next, please? With the Saxons, we're not very much better off. All we know there is they actually named the site. The earliest place names we have, Starnhenges, the stone hanging places. And that, of course, comes from this idea that the trilithons of Stonehenge very much represented or resembled the multiple gallows that were popular in Saxon and then slightly early medieval times. So again, that doesn't tell us very much, apart from the fact that the Saxons saw a resemblance between Stonehenge and these places of execution. So we've now come along virtually up to 1000 AD. So Stonehenge has been abandoned for 2000 years. Next, please. In the Middle Ages, the most popular explanation for the erection of these massive stones was that they had been put up by giants. And one can understand that when you look at the colossal Sarsens at Avebury, or the Trilithons at Stonehenge, or many people must have thought no human beings could ever have done this, so it must be the work of some supernatural beings, hence the giants. And this lasted for a long time. I think it's probably gone out of fashion now, but it was not abandoned for many centuries after this. Yes, please. This is the worst thing that ever happened to Stonehenge. Geoffrey of Monmouth, making up a so-called history of Britain, decided that the magician Merlin, Arthur's Merlin, had popped over to Ireland and come back with the stones and erected them on Salisbury Plain. Now that's a nice fairy story. And you might think has done no harm. It has done incredible harm to the story of Stonehenge. Have the next, please. We obviously have this nonsensical picture of Beaker people carrying huge stones along the Welsh coast to be erected on Salisbury Plain of Stonehenge. But this is one of the great fictions of British prehistory, and I think it would take another 50 years to eliminate it altogether. If those stones, as we know they did, came from southwest Wales, it wasn't these people, who are probably the most suicidal seafarers I've ever seen. I don't know whether anybody has or read about a couple of months ago how they tried to emulate this. It was a pretty good, reconstruction. First of all, they got a stone that was too light. Then they decided they wouldn't drag it over the rough ground. They would drag it along roads. To make life a bit easier, they put wire mesh on the road so it would pull a bit more easily. When they got to the hard parts, like going uphill, they used a lorry. Tell that to the Beaker people. And then, of course, they were going then to use the Kennet and Avon Canal to get the stone to Salisbury Plain. The only problem with that, of course, is they got about half a mile outside Milford Haven and everything collapsed, and the stone sank to the bottom. I mean, that is all the modern aids they could think of. This is really a quite incredible reconstruction, but popular myths are popular, and it'll take a long, long time to get rid of it. And I get correspondence almost weekly saying, how can you say this? It's quite obvious that you're wrong. Next, please. This is how Tudor people saw Stonehenge, blurred. It's good beer in that pub, isn't it? But sometimes you see these stones in early Tudor drawings as if they were men turned into stone. This idea of petrifaction, as if these really were people that had been turned into stone. Of course, you'll recollect the story of the nearby Rollright Stones to see how widespread this idea was. But you can just about see down here, those of you who can see as low as that, they're digging into one of the round barrows around Stonehenge in the hope of finding treasure and so on. There's still no reaction to what Stonehenge might have been. And so we're now, this is 1576. So we've now come 2,500 years from the time Stonehenge was abandoned, and people still haven't really approached it to say, what is it we're looking at? How is it made? How old is it? What was it used for? 2,500 years. Next, please. Well, at the very beginning of the, well, actually in the middle of the 17th century, the King's architect, Inigo Jones, had a good look at Stonehenge. And of course, don't forget, people had no idea of how old antiquity was. And Inigo Jones decided that Stonehenge was a Roman monument. And he wrote a book to prove this. Have next, please. This is how he saw Stonehenge. All very nice, all very neat. And of course, his argument was completely mistaken, but at least he had tried to put it into some sort of historical context. And so now, this in a sense is possibly the first attempt to date Stonehenge, and he was going to put it down around about the time of Hadrian, so we're talking now of Stonehenge being, in his time, 1,400 years old. And that's not surprising, because there was no idea of the depth of antiquity. Next, please. But things are going to get better. Because this is the plan by that marvellous antiquarian, eminent field worker, Dr Aubrey, in 1666. It's the first reasonably good plan of Stonehenge itself. And Aubrey was a romantic, but he was also a realist. He said, of stone circles in general, they're found in places in Britain and in Ireland where no Romans or Saxons or Danes ever went. So therefore, they must have been erected by people before the Romans. He then made a huge leap and said, and we think these are temples. They're obviously not fortifications, they're obviously not dwelling places, they're obviously not manufacturing depots. So presumably these are ritual. Archaeologists always use this word ritual when we can't explain anything, as you know. These are obviously ritual places. Who was in charge of ritual before the Romans? The Druids, and that's how we got Druids coming into it. But Aubrey was also, as I said, a realist. Have the next, please. And he saw ancient Britons like this. That's not bad, is it? I wonder how long it took him to make himself up. But you see, this is a very unromanticized view of the past. He said, I suppose they were slightly less savage than the Americans, with apologies to our... but of course, he was talking about the reports of massacres and so on that were taking place on the other side of the Atlantic in the middle and later part of the 17th century. And this is how he saw ancient Britons, you know, as a pretty bloodthirsty lot. Druids, sacrifices, disembowelings, auguries of the future as you pull out a few intestines. Not the sort of thing we want to see going on inside the Rollright Stones, for example. Well, that was Aubrey, and if it had stayed like that, with progress being made, we might have got to where we are today a lot sooner. But, have the next, please. After Aubrey came William Stukeley, another great field worker, whose early work was very, very good and very objective. And he took up the idea of Druids, which was fine. But unlike Aubrey, whose Druids were organizing a very bloodthirsty, warlike society, Stukeley's Druids were really proto-Christians. And they were very gentle, philosophical. And they were to stay with us for a long time. So, unfortunately, William Stukeley's early work was rather spoilt by his later work when he felt the Christian church was undergoing a great deal of controversy and argument, and therefore he had to write his book about Stonehenge and about Avebury as a counterblast to these heretical ideas. And of course, that lessened his work considerably. But, can we have the next, please? What we can give him credit for is that he was the first person to realize that from the centre of Stonehenge, the monument was, as he said, very nearly, not exactly, very nearly aligned upon the midsummer sunrise. He was the first person to recognise that. He really was a great field worker. So you see, by 1740, when he published his book on Stonehenge, we now had, through John Aubrey, the idea that this was a prehistoric monument, whatever that meant, and that it was a place of ritual into which some astronomical alignment had been built. So we are gradually, if you like, defining a silhouette of Stonehenge. It's old, it's a temple of some sort, it's associated with a celestial event. Nobody could go any further than that because there was no written history, really, of prehistoric Britain. A few notes by Roman historians such as Tacitus, but nothing of any depth. And so this left the society or the people of Britain, Ireland, and so on, completely free to make whatever interpretations they want of what actually went on inside a place like Stonehenge. Can we have the next, please? This, you can't see it because the title's underneath the table. I've seen better orgies in the Women's Institute. But there we are. If that's what you want as an orgy, well, that's all right. This is one idea that these places had all sorts of dreadful things going on inside them. Have the next, please. I can't stand this slide. And that included this marvellous stone outside Stonehenge. Of course, this, as you'll realise, is the famous or notorious slaughter stone. Why is it the slaughter stone? Well, look at these lovely receptacles for the dripping blood of writhing, screeching victims. This is where they were disemboweled before the corpse was taken inside Stonehenge to be finished off, if it wasn't already finished off. Indeed. Of course, as you all appreciate, the problem with this is that originally the slaughter stones stood upright. But that's a very 19th century belief. When I did some work on the slaughter stone, it didn't get its name until really very, very late, because people looked at this and said, oh yes, of course, just look at these lovely receptacles. Have the next, please. It's good, isn't it? You know, as long as you're not inside. I first came across this, actually, in an unknown book by Charles Dickens, A Child's History of England. And he's talking about, wicker men and being burnt and so on. And don't forget, Dickens was writing in the middle of the 19th century, and this is very much the attitude that people had towards stone circles. Old, ritual, but the rituals were pretty horrid. So we haven't gone very much farther than William Stukeley 100 years before. Next, please. But then comes the period when Stonehenge really leaps forward. Some of the stones were leaning or had fallen. Some of them were re-erected or straightened. 2/3 of the stones at Stonehenge, are set in concrete, to keep them safe and so on. And so excavations took place that clearly enabled us to have a far clearer picture both of the age and of the activities inside this stone circle. I should, of course, also point out I'm cheating you thoroughly this afternoon, because this isn't a stone circle at all. It's a timber ring which people use carpentry techniques to recreate in stone. So, I mean, you should never call Stonehenge a stone circle in that sense, but it doesn't matter. Forget I ever said that. Let's get on to the next one. Next, please. These are the areas that William Hawley excavated, quite a lot. And he was able to point out that there had been an inner ring. There had also been post holes. So in other words, before the stones, there had been timbers at Stonehenge. And he found a very interesting double-lined approach from the little-known south entrance at Stonehenge, through an avenue, possibly blocked off from the outside view by this little palisade, into here. So now we have Stonehenge at least as a two-phase monument. Timbers first, followed by stone. These excavations took place in the late 1910s, and you had a final excavation in the early 1920s. So we're still talking about 80 years ago, but bit by bit, Stonehenge is being chipped away, and some ideas are coming as to what stone circles might have been. Next, please. This is the saddest picture I think I know in archaeology. When Hawley and Newell were excavating, they came across a place where William Cunnington, as a Richard Colt Hoare, had excavated in the very early 19th century. It is believed, though it's not been proven, that Cunnington had an Irish colleague who very, very kindly, thoughtfully for the future, left a bottle of port. There it is. It's now in Salisbury Museum. And Hawley and Newell were delighted at the thought of this. You know, why not? 100-year-old port? Marvellous. The cork had gone. You know, a sort of huge anticlimax. And it ends up here in this sad little case. So when you think of Stonehenge, if you go there next time, have a thought for these chaps. Look what I've found. Oh my God, you know. And next, please. Well, ladies and gentlemen, who are they? Right, which one? Quite right, yes. C14 plus or minus 2 or 3 Kensingtons. Right? Anybody else? Stuart Pickett? Bridget Trump? Malcolm Murray, photographer, Edinburgh University Archaeology Department? And there's my supervisor, Derek Simpson, now Professor of Archaeology in Belfast, who uttered to me the famous words, "You've chosen a difficult subject, stone circles, there must be at least 200. Yeah, at least. But this is an excavation, of course, again, a much better one than Hawley's because the techniques have developed so much. This is 1958. And you know, just looking at very little bits and pieces and trying to analyse exactly what they imply. Bit by bit, the picture's developing. Yes, please? But there's always the other side of the story. As stone circles became popular and people started wondering about them, because so little was known, it meant you could write, in a sense, what you liked about them. And so here we have earth magic, whatever that may mean. But there's Stonehenge. I mean, Stonehenge is, you can get astride Stonehenge and gallop off into the sunset because nobody can say you're wrong. Next, please. This is called, yes, can you elevate that for the benefit of everyone? The Sphinx and the Megalith. Stonehenge was built by Egyptian astronomer priests because they couldn't find a suitable site for making their celestial observations. So they built Stonehenge at exactly the right latitude, but unfortunately, for some reason, they decided to live at Avebury. It's only 20 miles. And the book says, so the chief astronomer priest died, no doubt of the long walk. But there we are. There's another thought of Stonehenge for you. Not getting us very far at all. Next, please. Stonehenge yet again, you see. Has now been translated into French, German, Spanish, and English even. Did we come from outer space? Next, please. And the answer, according to Thom Lethbridge, is yes, we did. Stonehenge was built by Beaker people who came from Mars. We'll now get back to archaeology, please. 1966 in this country, 65 in the United States. Gerald Hawkins, using the astonishment of a computer in those days, and it really was an astonishment, worked out there were all sorts of celestial alignments built into Stonehenge that were very, very precise, and Hawkins was able to write that he knew he was right because mathematics had proved him so. It's one of the most confident statements ever made about prehistoric archaeology in the last couple of 100 years or so. But it was a very influential book, and it did make people think about astronomical sightlines. If ever you come across a book written before 1960 about stone circles, well, you won't find one, but about Stonehenge and so on, archaeoastronomy is virtually never mentioned, or if it is mentioned, it's almost dismissed in derision. You know, how could anybody align in this damp, misty, cloudy climate of ours, taking no account, of course, that the climate has changed since early prehistoric times in this country. But this book made us think about it. I think it's completely mistaken, because he also said that the Aubrey holes are used as a great eclipse predictor, which they could have been, but almost certainly weren't. But I won't go into that because I'm not giving you a talk about the archaeology of Stonehenge. I'll just talk about Stonehenge and attitudes towards it over the years. Have the next, please. In a sense, much more important for our development and knowledge of stone circles and so on was the work of Professor Alexander Thom. Now, virtually everybody in this room will know what Thom proposed. His first book, not his first paper, but his first book was published in 1967, Megalithic Sites in Britain. And he put forward three quite startling ideas: that there had been a standard unit of measurement, his megalithic yard of 0.829 meters, or better still, 2.72 feet, which was used widespread from the Shetlands down to Brittany. That was the first idea. The second idea was that stone circles weren't always circular. Some of them were oval or egg-shaped or even complex in shape, and had been laid out using very, very precise geometrical plans. The third idea was that there were, if you like, astronomer priests who were capable of making the most minute observations of minor movements of the moon. So we have a unit of measurements, we have geometrical plans, and we have astronomical alignments. And here you see Thom's plan of this inner part of Stonehenge, you see, 1.5 megalithic yards across here, and the centre of, he realised, quite right, that the centre of the first Stonehenge is not the same as the centre of the later Stonehenge. All these things, see, one rod, that is 2.5 megalithic yards, and so on, the perimeter of 45 rods, and so on. It all fitted very, very neatly. So we have the shape and we have the unit of measurement. Can we have the next, please? And also we have the astronomical alignments. Unfortunately, as you can see, this one, to Gibbet Knoll, is actually a Civil War gun battery, which was not really in existence at the time that Stonehenge was built. But no matter, the thing is, people have often said to me, do you make fun of Thom? And I said, no, I've never made fun of Thom. I think every one of his conclusions was wrong. Every one. But he made us think about units of measurement. He made us think about shapes. He made us think about astronomical sightlines. Without Thom, we'd still be 50, maybe 100 years back in our researches. Never make fun of him. In fact, he and I corresponded friendly. I mean, he knew I disagreed with him. In fact, some of you will have heard me say this before. He always thought I was wrong. He always thought I was wrong, and I always knew he was. No matter. It was a friendly controversy between us, and I'm very grateful that he could do this sort of thing and make us think about these problems. Next, please. So by the 1960s, it was quite possible to say, first, a timber structure. Secondly, we've missed Bluestones out altogether here, never mind about them. Then we get this rather simple structure, and then the Bluestones are returned, and we get this final phase of outer circle, horseshoe of trilithons, horseshoe of Bluestones, inner circle of Bluestones, and these 4 station stones. And we even had a date. I think it was 1848 BC plus or minus 275 years, which it really is utterly useless, but it was the first date for Stonehenge. So we're able to put it back, it must be around about 2,000 years old or so, which is starting when you think that people have been talking about the reign of Hadrian or just a few years before the Romans and so on. We've come a long way. Next, please. We even have a very good idea of how the stones, these great sarcens, were brought. They, of course, have come from the Marlborough Downs, about 20 miles to the north of Stonehenge. I doubt if the rollers are right. I think they wouldn't have been much use, but we do they need a lot of people, and that implies quite considerable social cohesion. So again, we learn something about the society. Next, please. And the construction. We still haven't worked out exactly how they got these lintels on top, but this is one possibility, a sort of cat's cradle, and hauling these stones upright. We know how the holes were dug, straight-sided here, ramped on that side, so you could slip the stone in and pull them upright and so on. So we're learning quite a lot about the actual social conditions and the methods of construction of these rings. Next, please. We know that the first entrance at Stonehenge was quite narrow, and from this side, in line with the major northern moonrise, there's the midsummer sunrise. You'll notice that the heel stone is not in line with the midsummer sunrise. But then people widen this entrance by throwing a lot of this bank back. Have next, please, and you'll see the effect of doing this. By doing that, they virtually, by widening the entrance, virtually brought the heel stone into line with the midsummer sunrise. Not quite, it's still going to be in the same place, but it looks as if it's intended. Again, you see, we're getting subtleties now. Next, please. And if we look at the axis of Stonehenge, now you see we are getting quite interesting things. On the axis, towards this northeastern wider entrance, we have deposits of an adult and child, burnt bones there, similar deposits of adult and child there. We're beginning to wonder if we're not actually looking at sacrifices to give some potency to the entrance. And there are other deposits, so this very mysterious pottery called grooved ware appearing here. And there's a mace, a little most beautiful object we found at Stonehenge, a mace head of probably stone from Brittany. We used to think it was from Scotland, but Brittany is more likely. And that's in line with the major southern moonrise. So we are getting astronomical lines built into Stonehenge. We're getting dates of Stonehenge. The recent publication of Stonehenge and its landscape, which is a tome, it's a magnificent piece of research. It's a sort of battery of information. We now know that the sarcens at Stonehenge were put up around about 2600 BC, but the earlier volume was obviously centuries older than that. So we've learnt quite a lot. Next, please. But one thing that hasn't really been noticed until the last few years is that inside the circle there is this horseshoe-shaped setting, and there's a horseshoe-shaped setting inside there as well. We don't get horseshoe-shaped settings in Britain or Ireland. Have the next, please. That will have to sharpen, I think, if you will. Thank you very much. There's Stonehenge, or just here. There might even be a horseshoe-shaped setting inside Avebury as well, which is quite an interesting thought. But look how scattered otherwise. Against the sea here, in the centre, that's not an odd one, against the sea here, against the sea there, against the sea there. But look how many horseshoe-shaped settings there are in Brittany. Now it's only 120, 150 fairly easy miles across the channel to there. So it's very likely that we are looking at Stonehenge not only as a timber monument converted into stone, but as a stone monument which has quite strong, not only British, but Breton influences built into its architecture. Next, please. And there's some proof of this because we have these carvings, dagger and inverted axe, another inverted axe there. We don't get carvings like that generally inside British megalithic monuments. There the art is all abstract. Next, please. More axes here. Lots of them. And next, please. But also, almost unnoticed until Atkinson saw it, you have this rectangular shape on one of the stones. We don't get that shape either in British monuments. Next, please. But we do get axes on megalithic tombs in Brittany, and we do get rectangular shapes on megalithic tombs in Brittany, usually associated with what looks like, according to the Breton archaeologists, and I don't disagree with them, usually associated with a protectress of the dead, because often she's found carved just where the passage joins at an angle to the burial chamber. And she's there with her axe or her dagger or whatever, as if she's trying to look after the dead. So, if you remember, there's another axe, very simple, and so on. Next, please. That's the stone I just showed you before it was lifted. See, here's the rectangle. That's all right. But look. Never noticed before. But there it is, a nice little Breton axe. Now, what this means, of course, is, if the interpretation is right, can I have the next, please? That this chap is standing inside would have passed through these stones covered in axe carvings. Over here, he'd have seen the dagger and the axe to his left. Here would have been the carving with the axe there. So he's standing in the centre of a monument whose age we now know, whose method of construction we now know, and we can actually see the symbolism built into Stonehenge, a monument very much concerned with death and presumably regeneration. Next, please. And of course, he's looking towards the midwinter sunset as well. One of my students once looked at this picture in awe and said, "Dr. Burl, did you take this photograph?" And I said, "Yes, from a calendar." Next, please. Well, there you are. You might or might not agree, but I've done my best to explain. There's always, of course, one last explanation for the whole problem of Stonehenge. Next one, please, the last one. Thank you very much.
Are you happy to take questions? Thank you, Aubrey. That was really good. So, Dr. Burl, we're going to take some questions. So that's not more
Easy ones.
yes.
Dr. Burl, are you saying that bluestones weren't imported to Stonehenge? They were actually found locally?
Yes.
So
one word isn't a sufficient answer. No, I think the bluestones were almost certainly glaciated to within about 7-10 miles of Stonehenge. This is a huge debate that's still going on. In fact, I'm hoping to set up a day school where this thing can be debated thoroughly, you know. But I won't go into all the details about this, but one of the great stumbling blocks that geologists, who always say this is absolute rubbish, and they have reason to say this, one of the great stumbling blocks is, how is it if the bluestones weren't glaciated, how is it we found, or I didn't, a bluestone was actually found buried deep in the body of a long barrow near Stonehenge, a long barrow which must have been closed, totally closed, at least 6 centuries before the bluestones got to Stonehenge.
yeah, I take your point. what I would suggest is I find it remarkably coincidental that at the periods we're talking about, that they can select a number of rocks which are geologically exactly the same from a glacial deposit. And I would suggest if they're from actually a glacial deposit, then there would be some degree of variability in the precise lithology. To prehistoric man, all they'd actually have seen is a rock which is black and shiny, and for whatever purpose, they wanted to put it in their stone circle.
Right, be polite. Bluestones are spotted dolerite, plain dolerite, rhyolite, volcanic ash, sandstone. Want some more? They are a ragbag. Some of it is superb stone that has stood up to weathering for thousands of years. Others weathered into stumps within a century. It's just the sort of rubbish that people who wanted stone, there is no stone available on Salisbury Plain, it's chalk, and any good stone is buried, and prehistoric people didn't quarry it normally. They were so glad to find this ragbag that they just took what they could. It's not, the stones are not homogeneous, they are a complete mixture of whatever, exactly the same sort of stuff that you get into Bricellis, but they're not all the same stone at all. Does that destroy your argument?
Good. I have not read the recent analysis.
No, I'm just pointing out, but I mean, this is one of the reasons I debated this whole argument that one would have thought if these experts, don't forget these people were expert stonemates or the judges of good stone. You would have thought they'd say, well, we want to put up a nice stone circle, magical mountain, let's get the best stone, this is the best stone. They knew the best stone, because a few centuries later they're actually using the Bricellis as an axe factory, to get the very best stone and so on. So why don't they take this incredible mixture of good, average and poor stones?
Doesn't that go down to that too? It might be some purpose to the stones themselves.
Well, in that case, yes, this is a possibility. You might say this is such a magical place, we'll take whatever stone there is. I just don't believe that, but this is it's never going to be proven one way or the other. But I think all the evidence, the majority of the evidence is against the deliberate transportation.
The barrow which you referred to earlier, Doctor.
Sorry?
The barrow which you referred to earlier with the stone inside.
The Bowles barrow, yeah.
Which barrow is it?
Bowles barrow.
Does that have a number?
The answer is yes, it does.
Well, I know it's sufficient. I'm just wondering which one it is.
It's warm. Can't be warm, can it? It could be Heytesbury 7 or something like that. It's in the Grinsell, and it's a bowl barrow, so you'll be able to find it. Yeah, thank you.
Dr Burl, with reference to the Rollrights particularly, I'd like to make any comment about the existence of ley lines.
No.
And why not?
Dangerous company. I don't believe in ley lines.
They do exist.
Sorry?
They can be found by divine means.
Well,
And they are magnetic forces in the ground.
wholehearted, sensitive people believe in ley lines. So I just don't believe in them. That's right. I spent a lot of time, actually. In fact, when my first book about stone circles came out, Paul Devereux, of course, who was a fervent ley liner, said how I actually found an archaeologist who had actually read about ley lines before I decided that I didn't like them. And I still don't like them. But I can't say any more than that because it's a long discussion in itself, but I'll say very briefly why, because they are not homogeneous. We'd rather go back to your stones. If you find me a ley line consisting of stone circle, or standing stone, or even a St Michael's Church, I'll start believing. But when you find a ley line consisting of a stone circle, a standing stone, a hill fort, a green road, a mill that might or might not have been there, a hill fort which is half a mile wide. I just don't believe in them. These are strong words. Yes, sir.
Here's a fact. They cut down logs and then they moved the stones with them. If one of them tries to fall over, they take the tree trunk round to the front and then put it in so it can move.
That's pretty clever. That could be right.
Dr Burl, could you tell us anything about why Stonehenge is actually where it is? It's obviously probably one of the most elaborate stone circles in the British Isles. Is there any reason why it should be? It's not on the crest of a hill or anything, it's just sort of...
No, it's on the slope actually. It slopes one way and slopes the other way, so it's most peculiar. I think there is a fairly simple answer. It was put up at the centre of a whole ring of, obviously much earlier, long barrows. So that we're, make it very simple. If you think of a long barrow as being a family monument or a clan monument, as society started becoming more cohesive, and they needed, if you like, a communal monument, what better than to put it up in the centre of this ring? And there is quite a lot of support for this, because if one looks at other important sites such as Arborough or Stanton Drew or Avebury, we come across the same phenomenon, that they do stand at the centre of a ring of long barrows. It doesn't follow they also stand at the centre of the ring of later round barrows. Stonehenge does, Avebury doesn't. But I think the answer to your first question is, if you want somewhere that everybody can come to, whether it's from the north or the east and so on, put it up pretty near the centre. And I think that's the answer.
Thank you.
So I wonder in that sense then, what would possibly be the difference between a site that was easily accessible for people, whether if it was a place for worship and ritual, as opposed to a site, like I visited the Druid Circle in North Wales, and to find it, to get to it was practically impossible. I just wondered why there's such a huge difference in that sense between those different types of sites in terms of what their purpose actually was.
Well, the Druids, you're quite right, we're getting up from 10 Man Mount to the Druid Circle. For a start, we think it was put up alongside a prehistoric trackway. So in other words, it's quite close to an established trackway, whether it's prehistoric or not, but probably. But, of course, it can't be at the centre, because there's not a sheer drop, but a very steep drop. But, of course, there were circles to the other side of it, and there's little circle 275. But it does stand, if you like, at the crescent of long barrows, long cairns. I think there, with the Druid Circle, you could trust you to pick a difficult one. It does stand at this half crescent of long cairns, which are still there, and also against the trackway. So I think it's combining two things there. But don't forget also, not so much with the Druid Circle and Stonehenge, but stone circles, of course, last over a very long period, from about 3,200 to certainly down to 1,500. So you're talking about nearly 2,000 years, and they're going to change in their function. And that's where the next stage will be, I think. People will start and look at it. But I don't think the Druid Circle actually really breaks this suggestion, but every circle is going to be different. And prehistoric people were completely thoughtless as far as we were concerned.
What do you make the reason I think most of Stonehenge are in a relationship with the
I don't. They exist. In fact, I was quite interested because if you probably realise that it was Newham, wasn't it? It's funny how... I'm sorry, I'm talking too long, aren't I? It was Newham. I was going to say, it's funny how some of the big insights in prehistory have come not from archaeologists, from this chap, Peter Newham, who was an ex-gas board manager. And he did a very nice little book called I think it's called The Astronomy of Stonehenge. And he suggested these post holes, and you can still see them marked in the, painted white, as it were, in the car park at Stonehenge. He suggested that from the centre of Stonehenge, those stones, great posts, stood in line with a couple, a lunar and a solar alignment. Oh, this intrigued me, and so I wrote to Faith Thatcher, who was at that time curator of Avebury Museum, and said, look, these are post holes, so therefore it's wood. What sort of wood was it? Was it oak? Because oak was the Neolithic wood around Stonehenge. No, it wasn't. It was pine, which of course is Mesolithic, as you just suggested. And then I said, well, what sort of date have you got? She had two dates, and they were both uncorrected, round about 7000 BC. So corrected would be even older. So those posts had been put up and had long since perished thousands of years before Stonehenge was even thought of. So the astronomical alignment is irrelevant. So when you ask what do I make of them, the answer is I don't make anything of them because they're there. They're undoubtedly post holes. Faith Thatcher was a very good archaeologist, and the date's all right, and they're Mesolithic. But unless a great area of the car park was ripped up and excavated to find others, they're just a rather irregular line of post holes. Well, it could be. I mean, you see, this is where speculation goes. It could be. This has already been established for a long time as a rather special place. But I can't see why. It could be. I mean, these are questions that archaeologists ask and archaeologists can't answer. So I'm sorry about that.
What's the adjusted date of those post holes?
I don't think we can adjust them at the moment because they're so old. Once you get back to 7,000 uncorrected, you could guess and say 8,000-9,000. Is that right, George? Or do you think it's possible to push back? Yeah.
You're saying the longer you go back,
yes, the farther
the corrections become.
Do you get a sense of keeping up with the Joneses in a tribal sense? When you look at the history of stone circles and the development of them.
Do I?
Yeah, well, yeah. Does that come through?
Yeah, slightly. I live in a state of perpetual bewilderment. Because there are so many of them, they're all so different, they're such different periods. It's only recently this idea, yes ma'am, don't get, this idea of Breton connections come about. And these are all quite exciting ideas. And so this is why my bewilderment comes in, because when you come across this idea, you think, that can't be right. I mean, I was lucky with this because I've not only been, as it were, talked into stone circles. Did I ever tell you how I got into stone circles? No. Would you like to know how I got into stone circles? Yes, of course. I decided that because I became more and more interested, I used to teach history. I became more and more interested in prehistory, so I went to Leicester University and said, look, I'd like to read for a high degree in MA. So I can go and see your supervisor, who was, as he is now. So I went along and said, well, what do you propose to study? Beaker pottery. No, you can't do that. David Clark's doing that in Cambridge. Grooveware pottery. No, you can't do that. Arnold McKinsey to do that up in Edinburgh. Human pathology. No, I'm not qualified to supervise that. I've been to the stone. I've been to this Rollright. Don't even look. I've been to Rollright Stones. It's a Rollright Stone circles. Oh, good, he said. Because it must be at least 200. That's how I got. You can all three of you be sitting here listening to me talk about Beaker pottery. It just shows. Now, what's the question?
I'm intrigued by the Breton influence. I mean, do you think some Breton people would have come over? Because it's so strange that there isn't much Breton influence elsewhere in Britain. And how do you feel you want to explain that?
Well, there's actually quite a lot of Breton material in southern Britain. If one starts searching for the material.
I know there's links in style, but...
Yeah, quite right. There are links in style, and in fact, it has been suggested that some of the Cotswold 7 tombs around Avebury had a Breton origin. Now, I'm not talking about invasions. I'm just talking about possible cultural visitations almost, and picking up ideas and so on. And there are also, believe it or not, so the Breton archaeologists haven't really taken this, there are actually British monuments in Britain. There's actually a little Scottish four-poster stone circle in the centre, no, it's not in the, it's in the south of Britain. So this is something which we're going to have to start studying in considerable depth, I think. At the moment, we're still, one of the things I find difficult, partly answering your question, is that we still are parochial in our thinking. And it's very difficult sometimes to find an Irish archaeologist prepared to accept the fact that there are British influences over there, or even the other way around, of course. The same thing applies with Brittany and so on. And I think the answer is not because we're being nationalistic and keep off our patch, but because there's enough to do on our patch not to start looking outside. And so we've got, you know, quite a long way to go in terms of research. But I think as time goes on, people will find there's far more between this Breton southern British connection than we have thought until. What I was going to say is I was lucky, and I now said you want to know how I got into stone circles. I was lucky because first of all I got into stone circles by accident, as you've just been told. But 20 years ago, some friends of mine, including Derek Simpson, went across to Britain to look at some of the famous monuments, such as Karnak and so on, and we couldn't find Barnum. Now, Barnum is 4 times the size of this room. It's immense. It's tall, it's long. We couldn't find it. And I said, well, let's buy a guidebook in French. There wasn't one. Well, is there a guidebook in English? No. I said, why is there one? And of course they said, I don't hear right one. And so, for years, you know, my wife and I went over to Brittany, fieldwork. I'm still talking to you, I'm sorry. And so I was able to recognise features over there, and features about stone circles. It was that connection that helped. I mean, there are people who know lots about stone circles, but people know a lot more about Breton archaeology than I do. But nobody really had the same sort of double sense of information. That's a long answer to a short question, but
given the archaeological evidence, what's your view of the role of human sacrifice to prehistoric peoples in Western Europe?
well, first of all, of course, we haven't been able to prove it. And there are so many ways of killing people that wouldn't show up on the archaeological record anyway. We can see with certain of the Iron Age burials and so on, that they also have been sacrificed. Which I don't think is really what you're asking. You're really asking, why should people offer sacrifices? I think the answer to that is fairly straightforward, that the most powerful thing you can give to the forces of nature is a human life.
Are there many sites that show evidence of that type of sacrifice?
No, not in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age. There is, of course, the famous site of Woodhenge, where Cummins was reckoning in the centre, and they came across this skeleton of a 3 to 4 year old child. They thought they found 2 skulls. But when they examined the information and they found the skull, it was actually one skull that appeared to have been cleft in half, which seems a fair indication of sacrifice. Though even that's questioned just recently, that maybe it had just been split by pressure of flints on top. And there's a young woman on the Curragh in Ireland that appears to have been buried alive. And they found her sort of contorted skeleton. But no, there aren't. As I say, if you think sacrifice by poison or sacrifice by cutting a throat, or there's lots of other places that would not show on the skeletal evidence, we might be looking at sacrifices but not realising it.
So do you think it was widespread or not?
I don't think I want to answer that because I just don't know. I just don't know. It would be wrong for me to say yes or no.
I think 2 further questions. This show here again.
Right, yeah. Have we got any radiocarbon dates for these hundreds of stone circles that can tell us whether they were built before Stonehenge, at the same time as Stonehenge, or afterwards? Is there any link there?
Oh yes, we've got a lot of. There are a lot of radiocarbon dates. Stonehenge, the one we think of as Stonehenge, that great starting factor, around about 2,600. And I think probably the earliest readings, there are one or two quite early dates, about 3,200. So we've got about 6 centuries before that great starting structure was put up as Stonehenge. And then this goes on. I think the stone circles end round about 1500. There are some later dates, but I think they're of secondary material. So Stonehenge is pretty well in the middle of this development. Now, what we haven't got are good dates for timber circles. You see, stone circles survive. Sometimes a stone swallows, but this stone is stone and it survives. Timber circles rot. And there were probably lots of timber circles in southern Britain. And probably just as early as the early henges and the early stone circles. A colleague of mine, Alex Simpson, has written a very good book called Stonehenge and Timber Circles, but obviously you can't find a timber circle if you haven't a chance upon the post holes, and most of them have disappeared. So that's the third monument about which we know very, very little. But the answer is Stonehenge is in the middle of this. Strangely, we haven't got any dates for the post holes, have we, from Stonehenge? So we don't know quite how old that structure is.
What about Stanton Drew? Has that been done?
No, they found the post, well, they think of post holes, just by geophysical survey. Hasn't been a single date from Stanton Drew.
Just the last question, please.
Dr. Burl, you mentioned that the stone circles are all individually very different, but in a general way, they're amazing to me because they have a lot of similar characteristics. And that seems to indicate some sort of a broad cultural diffusion of the idea. It's almost as if there was a single architect who went around with a blueprint and said, if you're going to make one, only make it this way. I haven't run into a triangular circle. It wouldn't be a circle, of course. There's certainly some rectangular ones, but they seem to be like the 4 posters in the form of a circle. And it's difficult to explain that, except that there was some sort of a magical aspect to it, that they would collectively agree that could only be built a certain way, all facing inward and so on and so forth. Could you reflect on that for just a moment?
A flicker of a second. Because there are triangles on Exmoor. William Camden was mentioning these in 1610. Nobody's done anything about it, really. But there are triangles. But you've seen so many of these stone circles that you know very well that they are not all done to a blueprint because they are regional. Recumbent stone circles only exist in northeast Scotland or southwest Ireland. You don't get them anywhere else. Circles with centre stones exist in certain areas such as Cornwall and so on. Not very many others. But 4 posters exist in Perthshire. Not very. Each area is doing its own thing. It's all a variation upon this idea of putting up stones to enclose a space. But there are variation after variation after variation. It's one reason we don't like the megalithic yard. Because if you look at everything else, the pottery is different, the stone circles are different, the burial mounds are different. And yet these people theoretically all use exactly the same legend. I don't believe it. I think, each society said, well, this is the general idea. We have certain ways. I always assumed that they were trying to commune with the forces of nature. What causes a thunderstorm? Why are our cattle dying? And this sort of thing. What do you do about it? You can't say, oh, well, we'll just sit here and sort of let the flood drown us. You have to, if you don't know what's caused it, then you have to try to do something. And you think, well, it's come from up there. These are open air stone circles. In other words, you can commune straight away there. Then you need a place which is, as it were, safe for your rituals, this sort of communication. And as I said, archaeology simply will not answer that question satisfactorily. I can say this, and I say it with sincerity, but I can't say I am right. Because unless there's physical evidence, we have to live on the rubbish of the past, don't we? Really? It's what they've thrown away or lost or whatever, or broken. That's what we're left with. And we're not left with the dances, we're not left with the songs, we're not left with the folk stories, the lineages of ancestors and so on. You know, so we can go so far, and our play we just have to stop. Which is what I'm going to do now.
Somebody once said to me that archaeology is the only career that lies in ruins before you begin. Thank you very, very much to Dr Burl.
It's the only career where you start at the top.
Thank you very, very much, Dr Burl, and also to Thom for both their talks. We do have to vacate the hall very shortly, but for any of you who would either like to buy one of Dr Burl's books or get it signed, then we have a few minutes to do that. Thanks very much.